My name is Harper. I'm 24 years old, and I'm standing outside my childhood bedroom holding my college diploma that my parents refuse to acknowledge. My golden boy brother Blake just got caught embezzling $50,000 from our family business, but somehow I'm the one being blamed. My parents suspended my graduate school funding and demanded I confess to Blake's crimes before tonight's family gathering. As I stare at my diploma, I notice something that makes my blood run cold. There's a manila envelope on my desk that wasn't there this morning, filled with forged bank statements bearing my signature. Blake planted evidence in my room. This was his plan all along. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready to hear how my own family tried to destroy my future to protect their golden child, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about fighting back against family manipulation. Trust me, you won't believe how twisted this gets. Growing up in our house was like living in two different worlds. Blake's world, where he could do absolutely no wrong, and my world, where every achievement was scrutinized and every mistake was magnified. Blake was 26, 2 years older than me, and had been the family favorite since birth. He played football in high school while I focused on academics. He got a business degree from a state school while I graduated summa cum laude from a prestigious university. But none of that mattered because Blake was the son who would carry on the family construction business, and I was just the daughter who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention I could get. 3 weeks ago, everything changed when Dad discovered $50,000 missing from Reynolds Construction's main operating account. The money had been transferred out in small amounts over the course of 6 months, making it look like regular business expenses until someone actually audited the books. Dad called an emergency family meeting that Sunday afternoon, his face grave as he spread financial documents across our dining room table. Mom sat there wringing her hands while Blake and I waited to hear what had happened. When Dad announced the theft, Blake immediately sprang into action like he'd been preparing for this moment. Harper had access to those accounts, he said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. Remember when she did that internship here 2 summers ago? She helped set up the new accounting system. I felt the blood drain from my face as every eye in the room turned to me. Blake continued, his performance flawless. I didn't want to say anything because she's family, but I've noticed some irregularities in her spending lately. New clothes, expensive dinners when she visits. I thought maybe she was dating someone with money, but now I'm wondering. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I stammered out my defense, explaining that I'd been 3 states away at graduate school for the entire time period when the money was stolen. I showed them my class schedules, my dormitory records, even credit card statements proving I'd been nowhere near the family business. But Blake was ready for that too. He pulled out printed emails that appeared to be from my old college account, discussing transfer schedules and system access codes. He had receipts from ATM withdrawals made with what looked like my bank card, all near our hometown when I should have been at school. These have to be fake, I insisted, my voice rising with desperation. Blake, you know I would never steal from our family. You know me better than that. But when I looked at my parents, I saw doubt creeping into their expressions. Blake had always been persuasive, always knew exactly what to say to make himself look good and others look suspicious. He'd been practicing this skill his entire life, and now he was using it against me. Mom was the first to break ranks. Harper, honey, she said in that disappointed tone I knew so well, you've always been jealous of Blake's position in the company. Maybe you felt like you deserved something more after all your hard work in school. We understand if you made a mistake, but you need to take responsibility. Her words cut deeper than any knife could have. This was my own mother, choosing to believe her golden child over the daughter who had never given them a reason to doubt her integrity. Dad nodded slowly, as if Mom's words had confirmed his own suspicions. The evidence is pretty clear, Harper. Blake found these documents while doing routine maintenance on the computer systems. He could have kept quiet to protect you, but he did the right thing by bringing it to our attention. The way Dad said the right thing made it clear that he saw Blake as the hero of the situation and me as the villain who'd been caught. That's when Blake delivered his first real attack. I think Harper needs to step back from any family financial matters until this gets sorted out, he said, his voice filled with fake reluctance. Including her graduate school expenses. We can't be funding someone who might be stealing from us. The room went silent as the implications sank in. My parents had been paying my tuition and living expenses while I pursued my master's degree in forensic accounting. Without that support, I'd have to drop out immediately. I watched my family turn against me in real time, their faces shifting from confusion to disappointment to something approaching disgust. Blake sat there looking appropriately concerned and sad, like a brother forced to do something painful for the good of the family. But I caught something in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. For just a moment, when he thought no one was looking, Blake smiled. A tiny, satisfied smile that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about missing money or family loyalty. This was about destroying me, and Blake was enjoying every second of it. The meeting ended with my parents freezing my access to family funds and demanding I think seriously about what I'd done. They wanted a full confession by the end of the week, along with a plan for paying back the money. Blake offered to help mediate the situation, positioning himself as the reasonable family member trying to heal the rift I had supposedly created. As everyone filed out of the dining room, Blake lingered behind to put a sympathetic hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry it had to come out this way, sis," he whispered, just loud enough for Mom to hear. "But theft is theft. Maybe some time away from school will help you get your priorities straight." His grip on my shoulder tightened just enough to hurt, a physical reminder that he held all the cards in this game. I realized then that Blake hadn't just stumbled upon evidence of embezzlement. He'd planned this entire scenario, from the theft itself to framing me for it. The only question was how long he'd been setting me up for this fall. Blake didn't waste any time launching his campaign to make me look unstable and dangerous. 2 days after the family meeting, he called our parents in a panic to report finding a small bag of cocaine in my car's glove compartment. I was staying in my old bedroom temporarily while supposedly thinking about my crimes, so Blake had easy access to my vehicle. When Mom and Dad confronted me with the baggie, I knew immediately what had happened, but my protests fell on deaf ears. "This explains so much about your behavior lately," Mom said, shaking her head sadly. "The financial irregularities, the lying, the anger. Drug addiction makes people do terrible things." Blake stood behind her nodding gravely, playing the role of the concerned brother who'd discovered his sister's dark secret. The timing was perfect because it gave him a motive to explain my supposed embezzlement. Who steals $50,000? A drug addict who needs money for their habit. Within hours, Blake had escalated his psychological warfare to digital platforms. My Facebook account started posting erratic status updates about feeling paranoid and unsafe, claiming that family members were spying on me and plotting against me. My Instagram stories became increasingly bizarre, featuring rambling videos where I supposedly talked about feeling confused and losing time. I didn't post any of these things, but Blake had access to my passwords from years of shared family computers and his tech-savvy background. When I tried to regain control of my social media accounts, I discovered that Blake had changed all the passwords and security questions. Every attempt to reset them led to more bizarre posts appearing, this time claiming that outside forces were trying to silence me and that I had evidence of family corruption that people didn't want revealed. To anyone watching my online presence, I looked like someone spiraling into paranoia and delusion. Blake was crafting a narrative where my accusations against him would appear to be the desperate lies of someone having a mental breakdown. The real masterstroke came when I discovered Blake had been recording our private conversations for months, maybe even years. He played edited versions for our parents that made me sound guilty and unhinged. In one recording, he'd spliced together phrases from different conversations to make it sound like I was confessing to the embezzlement while laughing about how easy it was to fool our family. In another, he'd manipulated audio to make me seem like I was threatening him with violence if he exposed my supposed crimes. That's when my cousin Tyler delivered the second devastating betrayal. I'd been confiding in Tyler since childhood, telling him about my fears that Blake was framing me and my desperate need to prove my innocence. Tyler was 25, Blake's age, and had always been like a brother to me. When I begged him to help me investigate Blake's activities, Tyler seemed supportive and eager to help. He offered to keep an eye on Blake and report back anything suspicious. What I didn't know is that Tyler had been feeding every word of our conversations directly to Blake. During a particularly emotional phone call where I broke down crying about feeling like I was losing my mind, Tyler recorded everything and sent it to Blake within hours. The recording was edited to remove Tyler's supportive responses, making it sound like I was having a paranoid breakdown while talking to myself. When Tyler finally confessed, he did it with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Blake offered me a management position at Reynolds Construction if I helped him gather evidence about your behavior, he said, not even having the decency to look ashamed. He said you'd been struggling with addiction and mental health issues for years, and the family needed documentation in case you became dangerous. I thought I was helping you get the treatment you needed. The betrayal cut so deep I actually felt physical pain in my chest. Tyler had been my closest confidant, the one person I thought I could trust completely. Blake had turned him against me with nothing more than the promise of a job and a convincing sob story about my supposed mental illness. I realized that Blake had been systematically identifying everyone I cared about and either corrupting them or using them against me. Blake's second major attack came in the form of a staged incident that would give him concrete evidence of my supposed instability. He arranged for me to meet him at a local coffee shop, claiming he wanted to talk privately about finding a solution to our family crisis. What I didn't know was that he'd invited several of his friends to be there as witnesses, positioned at nearby tables with their phones ready to record. During our conversation, Blake expertly provoked me by making subtle threats about having me committed and suggesting that maybe I should disappear before I brought more shame to the family. His tone was calm and reasonable, but his words were designed to trigger an emotional response. When I finally snapped and raised my voice, demanding to know why he was destroying my life, Blake's friends captured everything on video. The footage showed me appearing to threaten Blake while he sat there looking calm and concerned. "You're ruining everything," I said in the video, my voice shaking with rage and desperation. "I know what you're doing, and I'm going to prove it." Blake's response was perfectly calculated. "Harper, please calm down. You're scaring me. I just want to help you get better." His friends later testified to our parents that I'd been aggressive and threatening, while Blake had remained peaceful and tried to de-escalate the situation. This staged incident pushed me to my first near defeat. My parents called an emergency family meeting that night and presented me with an ultimatum. They'd spoken to a psychiatrist about having me committed for psychological evaluation if I didn't voluntarily seek treatment. The combination of the drug discovery, the social media posts, Tyler's evidence of my paranoid conversations, and now video footage of me threatening Blake had convinced them that I was dangerous and unstable. "We can't have you in the house if you're going to threaten family members," Dad said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Either you check yourself into a treatment facility and confess to the embezzlement, or we'll have no choice but to pursue legal options to protect Blake and the rest of the family." Mom sat there crying, playing the role of the heartbroken mother whose daughter had fallen so far from grace. Blake watched all of this with perfectly performed sorrow, occasionally reaching out to pat Mom's hand or nod supportively at Dad's ultimatums. But I caught him checking his phone during the meeting, and when I glimpsed the screen, I saw him texting someone about Phase 2 being complete. This confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Blake wasn't just reacting to an opportunity to frame me. He'd been planning this systematic destruction of my life for months, possibly years. Every move was calculated, every attack was coordinated, and every manipulation was designed to build toward this moment where my family would choose him over me without question. I realized then that Blake wasn't just trying to escape punishment for his embezzlement. He was trying to completely eliminate me as a threat to his position as the golden child. As long as I existed with my academic achievements and moral integrity, I would always be a reminder of what he could have been if he'd made better choices. By destroying my reputation and my relationships, he could cement himself as the only worthy heir to the family legacy while positioning himself as the hero who'd tried to save his troubled sister from herself. Blake's third phase of psychological warfare nearly destroyed what little sanity I had left. While I was staying at a cheap motel after being kicked out of the family home, Blake somehow gained access to my apartment near the university. I discovered this violation when I returned to collect some belongings and found my place had been subtly ransacked. Nothing obvious was missing, but I could tell someone had been through my papers, my computer, and my personal belongings. What I found 3 days later was far worse than simple burglary. Dad showed up at my motel room with a manila envelope full of financial documents that had allegedly been discovered in a hidden folder on my laptop. The papers showed a complex embezzlement scheme spanning 2 years, not just the $50,000 that had initially been reported missing. According to these forged documents, I'd been systematically stealing small amounts from multiple accounts, totaling nearly $300,000. The forgeries were sophisticated, featuring perfect replicas of my signature and detailed records of supposed transfers to offshore accounts. Blake had even created fake email chains between me and mysterious contacts discussing money laundering and tax evasion strategies. The level of detail was staggering, suggesting he'd been working on this frame-up for months or even years before putting it into action. "Harper, we found these files in an encrypted folder on your computer," Dad said, his voice hollow with disappointment. "The IT specialist Blake hired was able to recover them from your deleted files. This is so much worse than we thought." I stared at the documents in horror, recognizing my signature, but knowing I'd never signed anything like these withdrawal authorizations and transfer orders. That's when I realized the true scope of Blake's long-term planning. He'd been stealing from the company for years, but he'd also been preparing to pin everything on me from the very beginning. Every time I'd visited home during college, every family gathering where I'd used the shared computers, Blake had been collecting samples of my digital signatures and learning my password patterns. He'd been building this frame-up slowly and methodically, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. The documents painted a picture of me as a criminal mastermind who'd been embezzling funds since my junior year of college. They showed that the $50,000 was just the tip of the iceberg, and that I'd been running a sophisticated money laundering operation through fake consulting contracts and shell companies. The level of criminal expertise implied by these forgeries made me look like someone who belonged in federal prison, not graduate school. Blake's psychological manipulation reached new heights when he convinced our family that I'd been living a double life for years. He showed them edited photos of me at expensive restaurants and events, claiming they were evidence of my lavish lifestyle funded by stolen money. What he didn't mention was that these photos were from academic conferences and scholarship award dinners that I'd attended as recognition for my achievements. The third devastating betrayal came from someone I'd trusted completely. Brittany, my best friend since high school, called me crying to confess that she'd been secretly reporting my activities to Blake for months. Blake had convinced her that I was having a mental breakdown and needed protection from myself. He'd shown her edited recordings of me supposedly talking about suicide and self-harm, making her believe that monitoring me was an act of friendship. "He said you were in denial about your addiction and mental health problems," Brittany sobbed over the phone. "He showed me videos of you talking about wanting to hurt yourself and said the family was trying to get you help, but you kept refusing. I thought I was being a good friend by keeping him informed about your whereabouts and emotional state." Blake had manipulated Brittany's genuine care for me into a weapon against me. Every time I'd confided in her about feeling confused or overwhelmed by Blake's attacks, she'd dutifully reported those conversations to him. He'd used her intelligence reports to stay one step ahead of my attempts to defend myself, always knowing exactly what I was thinking and planning. The betrayal was made worse by the realization that some of my paranoid fears had been completely justified. I really was being watched and reported on, but by someone I'd trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities. Blake had turned my support system into his surveillance network, making me feel crazy for suspecting what was actually happening. Blake's fourth major attack involved weaponizing the legal system against me. He filed for a restraining order, claiming that I'd been stalking and threatening him for months. His evidence included the edited recordings, the staged coffee shop incident, and sworn statements from Tyler and Brittany describing my supposedly erratic behavior. The restraining order was approved based on the mountain of fabricated evidence Blake had assembled. This legal maneuver served multiple purposes in Blake's strategy. First, it made me look even more unstable and dangerous in the eyes of our family and community. Second, it legally prevented me from confronting Blake directly or trying to gather evidence against him. Third, it gave him a powerful tool to use if I tried to expose his crimes, since any attempt to contact him or investigate his activities could result in my arrest for violating the restraining order. I spent hours studying the forged financial documents, trying to understand how Blake had created such convincing fakes. The offshore accounts were real, the routing numbers checked out, and the digital signatures looked perfect. It was only when I examined them with a magnifying glass that I noticed subtle inconsistencies in the handwriting pressure and ink flow that suggested digital manipulation. But proving forgery would require expensive forensic analysis that I couldn't afford, and even then, Blake had positioned himself as the whistleblower who'd discovered my crimes rather than the perpetrator who'd committed them. He created a narrative where any evidence I presented against him would look like the desperate lies of a caught criminal trying to escape punishment by framing her innocent brother. The most terrifying realization was that Blake had been studying me for years, learning my habits and weaknesses so he could exploit them. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to make me react in ways that supported his narrative of my instability. He turned my genuine emotions into evidence of my guilt, making my truth-telling look like delusional ranting and my justified anger appear to be violent tendencies. As I sat in my motel room surrounded by the evidence of Blake's systematic campaign against me, I understood that I was facing an opponent who'd been planning this war for years while I didn't even know we were fighting. He weaponized my family's love for him and their unconscious bias against me, turning my own relatives into his unwitting accomplices in my destruction. The game was rigged from the start, and Blake had written all the rules. The extended family gathering was supposed to celebrate Blake's recent promotion to Vice President of Operations at Reynolds Construction, but it quickly transformed into a kangaroo court with me as the sole defendant. Blake had spent weeks preparing for this event, carefully briefing each family member about my supposed crimes and mental instability. By the time I arrived at my grandmother's house, everyone was looking at me with a mixture of pity, fear, and disgust. Uncle Frank, Dad's older brother and a part owner of the construction company, took the lead in what became an interrogation disguised as a family intervention. "Harper, we're all here because we love you and want to help you get the treatment you need," he said in the patronizing tone people use with mental patients. "But first, you need to be honest with us about what you've done to the family business and to Blake." The family had arranged themselves in a circle around me like I was some kind of dangerous animal that needed to be contained. Aunt Susan, my mother's sister, kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues as if my very presence was causing her emotional distress. Cousin Danny, who used to play video games with me during family holidays, wouldn't even make eye contact. Blake sat directly across from me, playing the role of the wounded but forgiving brother who just wanted his sister to get help. Blake's fourth major attack came in the form of his hired private investigator, a man named Rodriguez who presented himself as an independent expert. Blake introduced him as someone the family had retained to get to the bottom of the missing money, but it quickly became clear that Rodriguez was there to present additional evidence against me. The investigator was actually one of Blake's friends from college, but the family didn't know that. Based on my investigation, Miss Reynolds has been engaged in criminal activity since her sophomore year of college, Rodriguez announced, consulting a thick folder of fabricated documents. "I've traced a pattern of academic fraud, financial manipulation, and identity theft that goes back several years. The embezzlement from the family business is just the latest in a long series of criminal behaviors." He presented documents claiming I'd cheated my way through university using stolen assignments and bribed professors for grades. According to his fabricated evidence, my academic achievements were fraudulent, and my scholarships had been obtained through false pretenses. He even had forged emails supposedly from professors expressing concern about my erratic behavior and suspected plagiarism. The family absorbed this information with shocked silence, their image of me as the academic achiever crumbling in real time. Blake had systematically destroyed not just my current reputation, but my entire history of accomplishments. Every success I'd earned through hard work was now being reframed as evidence of my criminal cunning and willingness to cheat. Rodriguez continued his presentation with financial records supposedly showing that I'd been living far beyond my means throughout college, funding an expensive lifestyle through theft and fraud. He claimed I'd been running credit card scams and insurance frauds to finance lavish spending on designer clothes and luxury vacations. The evidence was entirely fabricated, but it painted a picture of me as a master criminal who'd been deceiving the family for years. The pattern is clear, Rodriguez concluded. Harper has been manipulating this family's trust and loved to fund her criminal activities. She's not the victim here, she's the predator who's been systematically stealing from the people who care about her most. Blake nodded sadly at these revelations, occasionally reaching over to pat Mom's hand as she wept at this betrayal by her daughter. The family demanded that I not only confess to the embezzlement, but also to what they now believed was a lifelong pattern of lying, cheating, and manipulation. Uncle Frank wanted me to admit that I'd been jealous of Blake's position in the family and had been sabotaging him for years. Aunt Susan insisted that I confess to manipulating her son Tyler into helping me cover up my crimes. Cousin Margaret demanded that I apologize for the trauma I'd caused the entire extended family. "We know you've been planning this for years, Harper," Uncle Frank said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Blake has shown us evidence that you've been systematically undermining him since childhood, spreading lies about him and trying to turn the family against him. This embezzlement is just your latest attempt to destroy everything he's worked for." Blake had somehow convinced them that I was the mastermind behind a decades-long campaign to destroy his reputation and steal his birthright as the heir to the family business. According to his twisted narrative, every achievement in my life had been motivated by jealousy and a desire to overshadow him. My academic success wasn't the result of hard work, it was a calculated attempt to make him look bad by comparison. The most devastating part of the tribunal was watching family members I'd loved my entire life repeat Blake's lies with complete conviction. Grandmother Rose, who had always been proud of my achievements, now spoke about me like I was a stranger who'd infiltrated the family under false pretenses. "I should have seen the signs," she said sadly. "The way you always had to be the center of attention, always trying to outshine Blake with your grades and accomplishments. I thought it was healthy competition, but now I see it was something much darker." This brought me to my second near defeat. The family presented me with an ultimatum that felt like a death sentence. They wanted me to publicly confess to the embezzlement, apologize to Blake for years of supposed sabotage and manipulation, and voluntarily commit myself to a psychiatric facility for long-term treatment. If I refused, they would not only press criminal charges, but would also ensure that I was permanently cut off from the family and that my supposed crimes became public knowledge. "We've already spoken to a lawyer about filing charges," Dad announced grimly. "The evidence is overwhelming, and the district attorney is very interested in prosecuting financial crimes against family businesses. You're looking at federal charges for money laundering and tax evasion, which could mean decades in prison. Your only chance for leniency is to confess everything and cooperate fully with the investigation." The psychological pressure was unbearable. Sitting in that room surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, being treated like a criminal and a monster, I felt my grip on reality starting to slip. Blake had done such a thorough job of poisoning them against me that they genuinely believed I was capable of the elaborate crimes he'd described. Their love for me had been completely replaced by fear and disgust. Blake watched my breakdown with what looked like genuine concern, but I caught the satisfied glint in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He'd orchestrated this entire spectacle, turning my own family into his weapon against me. Every tear my mother shed, every disappointed shake of my father's head, Every fearful glance from my cousins, it was all part of Blake's psychological warfare designed to break me completely. As the family continued their demands for confession and contrition, I realized that Blake had achieved something truly diabolical. He'd convinced my family that destroying me was an act of love, that forcing me to confess his crimes was somehow helping me face my problems and get the treatment I needed. He'd made them believe that they were saving me from myself, when in reality they were helping him complete my destruction. Just when I thought my world had completely collapsed, salvation came from the most unexpected source. Aunt Diane, my father's younger sister who had been estranged from the family for nearly 5 years, reached out to me through a carefully worded Facebook message. She'd heard about the family crisis through the grapevine and wanted to meet privately to discuss what she called concerns about Blake's version of events. Diane had always been the black sheep of the Reynolds family, partly because she'd married outside their social circle and partly because she'd been vocal about their toxic family dynamics. Her estrangement had deepened when she'd accused Blake of stealing money from grandmother Rose several years earlier, allegations that the family had dismissed as jealousy and troublemaking. Now she was reaching out to me with information that could change everything. We met at a diner 30 miles from town, far enough away to avoid being spotted by family members or Blake's network of spies. Diane looked older than I remembered, with worry lines around her eyes and a wariness that suggested she'd been carrying heavy secrets for years. She ordered coffee with shaking hands and spent several minutes checking to make sure we weren't being watched or recorded. "Harper, I need you to know that I never believed Blake's story about you embezzling money," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know his true nature because I caught him stealing from Grandma Rose when he was 19 years old. He took nearly $10,000 from her savings account over the course of 6 months, forging her checks and using her ATM card. My first real ally emerged as Diane revealed the depths of Blake's criminal history that the family had covered up. She'd discovered Blake's theft when grandmother Rose asked her to help balance her checkbook and noticed the discrepancies. When Diane confronted Blake with the evidence, he'd initially denied everything, then claimed it was a misunderstanding, and finally broke down crying about gambling debts and promised to pay everything back. The family chose to handle it quietly, Diane continued, her voice bitter with old resentments. Blake paid back the money, supposedly, and everyone agreed to forget it ever happened. But I knew he hadn't learned his lesson. I knew he'd do it again when the opportunity arose. That's why I started keeping my own records of his activities. Diane pulled out a thick folder containing years of documentation about Blake's suspicious behavior. She'd been secretly investigating his activities since the incident with grandmother Rose, documenting his expensive lifestyle that far exceeded his legitimate income. The evidence included photographs of Blake's luxury cars, receipts from expensive vacations, and records of gambling activities at local casinos that suggested he had serious addiction problems. "Blake has been living like a millionaire on a middle management salary," Diane explained, spreading photos across the table. "These cars alone cost more than he makes in 2 years. He's been taking expensive trips to Las Vegas every few months, staying in high-end hotels and gambling away thousands of dollars. This lifestyle suggests he's been stealing far more than the $50,000 your father discovered." She'd traced payments to offshore accounts and discovered that Blake had been preparing for this frame-up for months. He'd opened accounts in multiple countries using false identification, created shell companies to launder stolen money, and established a complex network of financial instruments designed to hide his crimes. The sophistication of his operation suggested this wasn't opportunistic theft, but a carefully planned criminal enterprise. "I think Blake has been embezzling for years, possibly since he started working at the company full-time," Diane said. "The amount he's stolen is probably in the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. He needed a scapegoat to take the fall when the federal investigation started closing in on him." This revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. There was a federal investigation into Reynolds Construction's finances, something Blake had failed to mention to the family. Diane had contacts in the banking industry who'd tipped her off about federal agents making inquiries about suspicious transactions and money laundering activities. Blake's desperation to frame me wasn't just about avoiding family consequences, it was about staying out of federal prison. Diane had been gathering evidence for months, building a case against Blake while waiting for the right moment to present it. She'd documented his associations with known criminals, his gambling activities, and his increasingly erratic behavior as the federal investigation got closer to exposing him. She even had recordings of Blake discussing money laundering strategies with criminal associates. Blake has been working with a network of people involved in construction fraud and money laundering, Diane explained. He's been using the family business to clean dirty money for these criminals, taking a percentage as his fee. That's how he's been able to afford his lifestyle while also feeding his gambling addiction. The scope of Blake's criminal activities was staggering. He turned our family's legitimate business into a front for organized crime, putting everyone's livelihoods and freedom at risk. The federal investigation wasn't just about embezzlement, it was about racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades in federal prison for anyone involved. Blake's fifth and most dangerous attack came when he discovered that Diane was helping me. Someone had spotted us at the diner and reported back to him, prompting Blake to escalate his campaign to physical intimidation. I returned to my motel room to find my car windows smashed and threatening notes left on my windshield. The notes warned me to stop digging into things that don't concern me and suggested that accidents happen to people who ask too many questions. Blake maintained his innocent facade with the family while ramping up his intimidation tactics against me. He spread rumors that I was working with criminals to destroy the family business out of spite, painting himself as the victim of my increasingly desperate attempts to escape punishment. He convinced our parents that I was so mentally unstable and vindictive that I was now willing to fabricate evidence and make false accusations against him. She's gotten so delusional that she's actually accusing me of the crimes she committed, Blake told our parents with perfect wounded innocence. She's even convinced Aunt Diane to help her create false evidence against me. This is what drug addiction and mental illness can do to a person. They lose all connection to reality and start seeing enemies everywhere. The physical intimidation confirmed what Diane and I had suspected. Blake was far more dangerous than anyone realized. His criminal associations meant he had access to people willing to use violence to protect their interests. The stakes had escalated beyond family drama into a situation where my physical safety was at risk. Blake was no longer just trying to destroy my reputation, he was preparing to silence me permanently if necessary. Diane and I began meeting secretly every few days to plan our counteroffensive against Blake's criminal enterprise. She'd rented a storage unit where we could safely review evidence and develop our strategy without fear of Blake's surveillance network. The space was filled with boxes of financial documents, photographs, and recordings that painted a picture of corruption spanning several years and involving multiple criminal organizations. Our investigation revealed that Blake had been using Reynolds Construction as a money laundering operation for a network of criminals involved in drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and construction fraud. He'd been accepting dirty money through fake contracts, running it through the company's accounts to make it appear legitimate, then transferring the cleaned funds to offshore accounts while taking a substantial percentage as his fee. Blake's not just an embezzler, Diane explained as we studied financial flow charts she'd created. He's a key player in a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. The federal investigation isn't focused on our family business. By accident, they've been tracking this criminal network for years, and Blake's activities have put him directly in their crosshairs. We discovered that Blake had made enemies within his criminal network by skimming additional money from their transactions and using their laundered funds to cover his gambling debts. Several of his criminal associates had grown suspicious of his activities and were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about missing money. Blake's desperation to frame me stemmed partly from his need to distance himself from these criminal connections before they decided to handle their suspicions more violently. My second crucial ally emerged when Tyler secretly switched sides after Blake became abusive and threatening toward him. Tyler called me in tears, confessing that Blake had threatened to frame him as an accomplice in the embezzlement if he didn't continue providing false testimony against me. Blake's mask had slipped during a private conversation where he'd revealed his true personality: cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless in pursuing his goals. "He's not the person I thought he was," Tyler sobbed over the phone. When I said I wasn't comfortable lying anymore, he grabbed me by the throat and told me I was in too deep to back out now. He said if he goes down, he'll make sure I go down with him. He's been recording our conversations too, editing them to make it sound like I was helping plan the embezzlement. Tyler provided us with recordings he'd secretly made of Blake admitting to the embezzlement and describing his plans to pin everything on me. In these conversations, Blake revealed the depth of his criminal activities and his complete lack of remorse for destroying my life. He laughed about how easy it had been to manipulate our family and bragged about his ability to make them believe anything he wanted them to believe. "The stupid bastards actually think Harper's the criminal," Blake said in one recording, his voice filled with contempt. "I've had them wrapped around my finger since childhood. As long as I'm the golden boy who can do no wrong, I can get away with anything." Harper was always too smart for her own good, so I had to find a way to neutralize her before she figured out what I was doing. The recordings revealed that Blake had been planning to frame me for nearly 2 years, ever since I'd started asking questions about some financial irregularities I'd noticed during family visits. He'd identified me as a potential threat to his operation and had systematically worked to discredit me before I could expose his crimes. My academic success in forensic accounting had made him particularly nervous about my ability to uncover financial fraud. We learned that Blake had been forging our father's signature on major business contracts, putting the entire family company at risk of bankruptcy and criminal prosecution. He'd committed the company to deals with his criminal associates without authorization, using the company's assets as collateral for money laundering operations. If his scheme collapsed, it would take the entire family business down with it. Diane and I developed a comprehensive plan to expose Blake's crimes while protecting ourselves from his increasingly violent threats. We copied all evidence to multiple secure locations, prepared detailed reports for federal authorities, and established contact with FBI agents who were investigating the money laundering network Blake had been working with. Learning to play dirty became essential for survival in Blake's world of criminal manipulation. I started carrying recording devices to document any interactions with family members, installed security cameras around my motel room to monitor for break-ins or vandalism, and began varying my daily routines to make it harder for Blake's associates to track my movements. We discovered that several other construction companies in the region had been victimized by Blake's criminal network, with employees being framed for embezzlement while the real perpetrators escaped justice. Blake's operation was part of a larger pattern of financial fraud that had destroyed multiple families and businesses across the state. The investigation revealed that Blake's gambling addiction was far worse than anyone realized. He'd been losing hundreds of thousands of dollars at illegal gambling operations run by organized crime figures, creating massive debts that he'd been paying off using money laundered through the family business. His criminal associates were growing impatient with his mounting losses and diminishing usefulness to their operations. Our evidence gathering intensified when we realized that Blake was planning to flee the country once he'd successfully pinned all the blame on me. He'd been moving money to offshore accounts and had obtained false identification documents that would allow him to disappear permanently. The frame-up wasn't just about avoiding punishment, it was about buying himself time to escape before the federal investigation closed in. Blake's escalation of psychological warfare included spreading rumors that I was working with his criminal enemies to destroy the family business. He convinced our parents that I'd become so desperate and vindictive that I was now collaborating with actual criminals to fabricate evidence against him. This narrative painted me as not just mentally ill, but actively dangerous to the family's safety and financial security. Harper has completely lost touch with reality, Blake told anyone who would listen. She's so determined to avoid taking responsibility for her crimes that she's willing to destroy everything our family has worked for. She's even reached out to some very dangerous people who want to see our business fail. I'm honestly afraid of what she might do next. The psychological pressure of maintaining our secret investigation while appearing defeated in public was exhausting. Blake's surveillance network made every meeting with Diane a potential security risk, and his escalating threats meant we had to assume our communications were being monitored. We developed code words and used secure messaging apps to coordinate our activities while maintaining the appearance that I'd given up fighting his false accusations. The annual Reynolds Construction Board meeting provided the perfect opportunity for Diane and me to execute our plan to expose Blake's criminal empire. The meeting was scheduled to discuss the company's financial irregularities and determine how to handle what everyone still believed was my embezzlement. Blake had positioned himself as the reluctant whistleblower who'd discovered his sister's crimes, expecting to be praised for his integrity and dedication to the family business. We'd spent weeks preparing our presentation, organizing evidence into a compelling narrative that would be impossible for the board to ignore. Diane had arranged for federal agents to be present as observers, ostensibly to provide guidance about cooperation with their ongoing investigation. Blake didn't know that the federal agents were actually there to arrest him once our evidence was presented. The meeting began with Blake delivering a polished presentation about my supposed crimes and the steps he'd taken to protect the company from further damage. He played edited recordings of my voice, displayed forged financial documents, and painted a picture of me as a master criminal who'd been stealing from the family for years. His performance was flawless, hitting every emotional note to maximize sympathy for himself and disgust toward me. It breaks my heart to be here today, discussing these terrible accusations against my own sister, Blake said, his voice trembling with perfectly manufactured emotion. But I have a responsibility to this family and this company to protect them from further harm. Harper has admitted to me privately that she's been struggling with addiction and financial problems, but she's refused all offers of help and treatment. The board members nodded sympathetically as Blake described his supposed efforts to help me overcome my problems before being forced to expose my crimes. He presented himself as the loving brother who'd tried everything to save me before reluctantly doing his duty to protect the family business. Several board members actually praised him for his courage in putting the company's interests above family loyalty. That's when Diane stood up and requested permission to present additional evidence that had come to light during her own investigation. Blake's confident expression flickered slightly, but he maintained his composure as Diane began setting up her presentation materials. He probably assumed she was going to support his narrative with additional evidence against me. Before we proceed with any decisions about Harper's future, I think the board needs to see some information that Blake hasn't shared with you, Diane announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Evidence that suggests the person responsible for the financial irregularities isn't Harper at all, but someone much closer to home. Blake made his crucial mistake when Diane began presenting evidence of his money laundering activities. Instead of maintaining his innocent facade, he panicked and started objecting to evidence he shouldn't have known anything about. When Diane showed photographs of him meeting with known criminals, Blake immediately launched into explanations about why those meetings were innocent business discussions. "Those photos are taken completely out of context," Blake protested, his voice rising with desperation. "I was investigating potential fraud in our subcontractor relationships. I had to meet with some questionable people to gather information about construction industry corruption. I was trying to protect the company from exactly the kind of criminal influences that Harper has been working with." The problem was that Diane hadn't yet explained who the people in the photographs were or what they were suspected of. Blake's immediate defensive response revealed that he knew exactly who these criminals were and why meeting with them would look suspicious. His panic was making him reveal information that only someone involved in criminal activities would know. Diane continued her presentation with recordings of Blake admitting to the embezzlement and describing his money laundering operations. The audio was crystal clear, featuring Blake's voice discussing specific criminal activities, naming his criminal associates, and laughing about how easy it was to manipulate our family. The board listened in stunned silence as their golden boy revealed himself to be a sophisticated criminal. "I've been recording conversations with Blake for months," Diane explained, because I suspected he was involved in the financial irregularities. What I discovered was far worse than simple embezzlement. Blake has been running a money laundering operation through Reynolds Construction, working with organized crime figures to clean millions of dollars in illegal proceeds. Blake's facade completely collapsed as he realized the extent of evidence against him. He made another devastating mistake by threatening Diane in front of the entire board, revealing the violent tendencies he'd been hiding behind his polished exterior. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled at Diane, his mask finally slipping to reveal the cold predator underneath. "There are people who won't appreciate you interfering with their business arrangements. People who know how to solve problems like you permanently." This threat confirmed everything Diane had been saying about Blake's criminal connections and his willingness to use violence to protect his interests. The board members recoiled in shock as they witnessed the real Blake for the first time. The loving son and dedicated employee they thought they knew was actually a criminal who was threatening family members to protect his illegal activities. The revelation that Blake had been secretly recording family conversations for years added another layer of horror to his betrayal. Diane presented evidence that Blake had been collecting blackmail material on various family members, recording private conversations and gathering compromising information that he could use to ensure their loyalty and silence. The board realized they'd been living under surveillance by someone they'd trusted completely. Federal agents chose that moment to make their presence known, announcing that they'd been investigating Blake's money laundering network for months and were ready to make arrests. Blake attempted to flee through a side door but was immediately apprehended by agents who'd been stationed throughout the building. His arrest in front of the entire family finally exposed his guilt to everyone who'd been defending him. The sight of Blake being handcuffed and read his rights was surreal after months of him being treated as the hero of the family drama. The board members and family friends who'd praised his integrity and condemned me were forced to confront the reality that they'd been completely deceived by his performance. Their shock and embarrassment were palpable as they realized how thoroughly Blake had manipulated them. As Blake was led away, he made one final attempt to maintain his innocence by claiming that I'd somehow orchestrated his arrest through my criminal connections. "This is all Harper's doing," he shouted over his shoulder. "She's working with these criminals to frame me because I exposed her embezzlement. Don't let her destroy this family to save herself." Even in handcuffs, Blake was still trying to manipulate the situation and cast doubt on my innocence. The federal agents confirmed that their investigation had completely exonerated me and identified Blake as the primary perpetrator of the financial crimes. They revealed that Blake had been under surveillance for months and that his attempt to frame me had actually helped them build their case by demonstrating his consciousness of guilt and willingness to obstruct justice. Blake's arrest triggered a cascade of revelations that devastated our family in ways none of us had anticipated. The federal investigation revealed that his criminal activities extended far beyond simple embezzlement, involving a complex network of money laundering, fraud, and racketeering that had put the entire family business at risk of seizure under federal asset forfeiture laws. The financial damage was staggering. Blake had stolen nearly $800,000 from Reynolds Construction over a period of 4 years, using sophisticated accounting manipulations to hide the theft. He'd also committed the company to fraudulent contracts worth millions of dollars, creating legal liabilities that threatened to bankrupt the business that 3 generations of our family had built. My parents were forced to confront their role in enabling Blake's criminal behavior and their willingness to sacrifice me to protect their golden child. The evidence presented during Blake's arrest made it impossible for them to maintain their delusions about his character or their treatment of me. Dad aged 10 years in a single day as he realized that his favoritism had blinded him to Blake's true nature. "I don't understand how we got it so wrong," Mom sobbed during our first family meeting after Blake's arrest. "We thought we knew our children. We thought Blake was the responsible one and that you were." She couldn't even finish the sentence, finally understanding how completely Blake had manipulated her perceptions and emotions. The family struggled with overwhelming guilt and shame as they realized how close they'd come to destroying an innocent person to protect a criminal. Uncle Frank, who'd led the tribunal against me, couldn't make eye contact during family gatherings. Grandmother Rose, who'd accused me of jealousy and manipulation, spent days crying about her role in Blake's campaign against me. Some family members found it easier to maintain their delusions than to accept the painful truth about Blake and their own complicity in my persecution. Cousin Margaret continued to insist that Blake must have been forced into criminal activity by some external influence, refusing to accept that the golden boy she'd admired was actually a predatory sociopath. These family members created lasting rifts by their inability to accept reality. The revelation of Blake's blackmail activities created additional trauma as family members discovered that their most private moments had been recorded and potentially weaponized against them. Blake had been collecting embarrassing information about relatives' personal problems, financial difficulties, and relationship issues, creating a climate of fear and surveillance that had lasted for years. Tyler struggled with enormous guilt over his role in Blake's campaign against me, unable to forgive himself for betraying someone who'd trusted him completely. He'd been one of Blake's primary tools for gathering intelligence and spreading disinformation, and the knowledge that his actions had nearly destroyed my life left him devastated with self-loathing. The extended family fractured along lines of those who could accept the truth about Blake and those who preferred comfortable lies. Some relatives continued to visit Blake in jail and maintained that he'd been unfairly prosecuted, creating holiday gatherings that became exercises in avoiding controversial topics. The family would never be whole again after Blake's manipulations had exposed the toxic dynamics that had existed for years. Reynolds Construction faced potential bankruptcy as federal prosecutors sought restitution for Blake's crimes, and civil lawsuits from victims of his fraudulent schemes multiplied. The business that had been our family's pride and legacy was reduced to a struggling company fighting for survival, its reputation destroyed by association with organized crime. Blake's gambling addiction had been far worse than anyone realized, with debts to criminal organizations that continued to threaten the family's safety even after his arrest. Federal agents warned us that Blake's criminal associates might seek revenge against the family for his cooperation with law enforcement, forcing us to consider relocating for our own protection. My parents struggled to rebuild their relationship with me while processing their own trauma from discovering that their beloved son was actually a monster who'd been manipulating them for decades. Dad's hero worship of Blake had been so complete that accepting the truth about his crimes meant questioning everything he'd believed about parenthood and family loyalty. The psychological damage from Blake's systematic manipulation campaign left lasting scars on everyone involved. Family members who'd participated in condemning me struggled with guilt and shame, while those who'd been blackmailed by Blake dealt with feelings of violation and betrayal. The trust that held our family together had been shattered beyond repair. During Blake's sentencing hearing, federal prosecutors revealed additional crimes that hadn't been part of the original charges. Blake had been involved in money laundering for drug trafficking organizations, had participated in construction bid-rigging schemes, and had been planning to flee the country with millions in stolen assets. His criminal activities had endangered not just our family, but the entire community. Even facing decades in federal prison, Blake continued to maintain his innocence and blame me for orchestrating his downfall. His final statement to the court was a rambling accusation that I'd somehow manipulated federal agents and fabricated evidence against him. He remained a master manipulator to the end, unable to accept responsibility for his choices. The sentencing brought some measure of justice, with Blake receiving 28 years in federal prison for his crimes. However, the damage he'd inflicted on our family relationships and business would take much longer to heal, if it ever could be repaired. Some wounds cut too deep to ever fully close, and Blake's betrayal had severed bonds that had taken decades to build. The year following Blake's sentencing was the most challenging and transformative period of my life. Initially, I was consumed with a rage so intense it felt like it might burn me alive from the inside. I'd been vindicated legally and within my family, but the emotional scars from months of systematic psychological torture didn't disappear overnight. I spent weeks replaying every moment of Blake's campaign against me, analyzing each manipulation and betrayal until I'd nearly driven myself to the same mental breaking point Blake had been trying to achieve. Aunt Diane became my anchor during those dark months, helping me navigate the complex process of rebuilding my life while processing the trauma of Blake's abuse. She'd found an excellent therapist who specialized in family trauma and psychological manipulation, someone who understood that my anger and paranoia weren't symptoms of mental illness, but reasonable responses to months of coordinated psychological warfare. Tyler's journey toward redemption became intertwined with my own healing process. He'd been so devastated by his role in Blake's campaign that he'd attempted suicide 6 months after Blake's arrest, unable to live with the guilt of betraying someone who'd trusted him completely. His recovery required him to understand that he'd been a victim of Blake's manipulation as much as an accomplice, groomed and exploited by someone far more skilled in psychological warfare than either of us had realized. Returning to graduate school felt like stepping back into a life that belonged to someone else. My classmates and professors had no idea what I'd endured, and I struggled to care about academic achievements that had once driven my ambitions. The field of forensic accounting, which I'd chosen for its intellectual challenges, now felt like a calling born from my experience with Blake's sophisticated financial crimes. I changed my thesis focus to family financial abuse, determined to help other victims of similar manipulation. The deeper patterns in my family became clear through months of therapy and reflection. Blake's golden child status hadn't been an accident of birth order or personality. It had been carefully cultivated through years of manipulation that had trained our parents to see him as perfect and me as problematic. He learned early that he could escape consequences for bad behavior by shifting blame to me, and our parents had enabled this dynamic by always believing his version of events. Mom's favoritism toward Blake had roots in her own family trauma, where she'd been the scapegoated daughter in a family that valued sons over daughters. She'd unconsciously recreated those patterns with us, seeing Blake as the child who would carry on the family legacy and me as the one who should be grateful for whatever attention I received. Understanding her psychology didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me process my own feelings of rejection and betrayal. Dad's worship of Blake stemmed from his own insecurities about masculinity and success. Blake represented everything Dad wished he could have been: confident, charming, and seemingly successful in business. Dad had lived vicariously through Blake's achievements while being blind to the moral corruption that enabled them. His devastation at learning the truth about Blake was partly grief for his own lost illusions about success and manhood. The legal proceedings continued for nearly 2 years as prosecutors unraveled the full extent of Blake's criminal network. New victims emerged regularly, families and businesses that had been destroyed by the same manipulation tactics Blake had used against me. I testified at multiple trials, helping prosecutors understand the psychological components of Blake's fraudulent schemes. Reynolds Construction's recovery was slow and painful, requiring complete restructuring under federal oversight. Dad stepped down as president, unable to continue leading a company that had been so thoroughly corrupted under his watch. The business survived, but as a shadow of its former self, employing fewer people and operating under restrictions designed to prevent future criminal infiltration. Some family relationships proved impossible to repair. Cousin Margaret and several others continued to believe that Blake had been unfairly prosecuted, creating a permanent schism in our extended family. Holiday gatherings became exercises in diplomatic navigation, with careful seating arrangements and avoided topics to prevent explosive confrontations between Blake's supporters and those who accepted his guilt. My relationship with my parents evolved into something more honest, but less warm than it had been before Blake's crimes came to light. We could communicate effectively and even show affection for each other, but the easy trust of childhood was gone forever. They'd proven that their love was conditional and that they'd sacrifice me to protect their preferred child. That knowledge created a permanent distance that no amount of apology could bridge. The federal agents who'd investigated Blake's case offered me insights into criminal psychology that helped me understand what I'd experienced. Blake fit the profile of a narcissistic sociopath who'd learned to weaponize family dynamics to create a perfect cover for criminal activities. His ability to maintain relationships while manipulating and exploiting people made him particularly dangerous because his victims trusted him completely. 3 years after Blake's sentencing, I graduated with my master's degree and immediately began working with federal law enforcement as a forensic accountant specializing in family financial abuse cases. My experience with Blake's manipulation tactics made me uniquely qualified to recognize and investigate similar crimes. I found purpose in helping other families understand how financial abuse operates and how to protect themselves from predatory relatives. Blake's imprisonment didn't end his attempts to manipulate and control the narrative around his crimes. He spent years writing letters to family members, alternately apologizing for his actions and claiming he'd been framed by criminal associates who'd threatened his life. Some family members wanted to believe his explanations, desperate to reconcile the Blake they'd loved with the criminal he'd proven to be. I learned to distinguish between forgiveness and reconciliation, understanding that I could release my anger without restoring relationships with people who'd proven themselves untrustworthy. Some family members deserved forgiveness because they'd been manipulated by someone far more skilled than they were. Others deserved only distance because they'd chosen comfortable lies over difficult truths. The anniversary of Blake's arrest became a personal holiday for me, a reminder that truth eventually surfaces even when it's buried under layers of sophisticated manipulation. I'd learned that being right isn't always enough to protect you from those who prefer convenient lies, but it's still worth fighting for truth even when you're standing alone against the world. My new apartment became a sanctuary filled with evidence of the life I'd rebuilt from the ashes of Blake's destruction. Photos from my graduation, awards for my work in forensic accounting, and letters from grateful clients who'd escaped their own family financial abuse situations. These tangible reminders of my resilience helped me remember that surviving Blake's attacks had made me stronger, not broken. The final lesson I carried from my experience was the difference between family loyalty and family toxicity. True loyalty doesn't require sacrificing innocent people to protect guilty ones, and real love doesn't demand that victims silence themselves to preserve family harmony. I'd learned to build my chosen family from people who valued truth and integrity over comfort and convenience. Standing in my living room surrounded by evidence of my hard-won independence, I understood that sometimes the greatest victory isn't being vindicated by those who wronged you, but finding the strength to thrive without their approval. Blake had tried to destroy me to protect his criminal empire, but his attacks had ultimately revealed my own resilience and capacity for survival. The woman who'd stood accused in that family tribunal 3 years earlier had been desperate for validation and acceptance. The woman I'd become understood that my worth didn't depend on other people's opinions, even when those people shared my DNA. Blake's greatest failure wasn't getting caught, it was underestimating my ability to survive his worst efforts and emerge stronger than he'd ever been. I'd found my voice, my strength, and my purpose through the crucible of his psychological warfare. Sometimes the most painful experiences teach us the most valuable lessons about who we really are when everything we thought we could count on falls away. Blake had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I could survive anything and still choose to build something beautiful from the wreckage. What would you do if your own family turned against you to protect a criminal? Have you ever experienced manipulation from someone you trusted completely? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it helped you understand the dynamics of family financial abuse. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming toxic family relationships and finding strength in impossible situations. Remember to share this with anyone who might be facing similar challenges. Your support could make all the difference in someone's fight for truth and justice. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that even in your darkest moments, you have more strength than you realize. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that their comfort is worth more than your truth.